I'm Dan Bean, and I'm director of the Palisade Insectary here in Palisade, Colorado, and we're the Biological Control Center for the state of Colorado. And biological control is the use of natural enemies against pests. All of our targets are invasive species. They come over here, they're out of control, they're out of this normal ecological web. We bring in a control agent, we stop having these problems where introduced species become totally out of control. Every plant, every insect, every organism has something that eats it or gives it a disease or somehow restricts it. We just use what would normally control a pest in an ecosystem. We were started in 1945 when the Palisade peach industry was threatened by the peach moth. And the peach moth, it's an exotic invasive species that came over from East Asia. Now normally if the peach moth attacks a peach, it bores into the peach, you open it up and it's just mush. We release a wasp that seeks out the peach moth when it's a young larva and lays an egg in it and kills it from the inside out. Once you've got biocontrol in the system and it's controlling your weed, the larger problem is brought under control. There aren't even many insectaries in the entire nation. I know of 3 that we have across the country. One's in New Jersey, one's in Idaho, and then there's our institution. So very few states have really taken a lead and pushed forward with biological control. And I think in that way, I feel proud of the state of Colorado for being a leader. It would be hard-pressed to find anything like the Palisade Insectary.
My name is Annie Carter. I'm the program coordinator at Colorado Canyons Association. CCA worked with the Bureau of Land Management to apply for the Greening STEM grant from the National Environmental Education Foundation with the idea in mind of taking students from Central High School's AP Environmental Science program on the river to allow them to apply what they learned in the classroom to actual in-field experience to help manage Russian knapweed, an invasive species, through the Russian knapweed gall wasp. The really exciting thing about this trip is that this might be an opportunity for students to spark that curiosity of becoming a scientist in the future. Students from Central High School's AP Environmental Science class, throughout the year they learn pieces about ecology and ecological monitoring. They learn about integrated pest management and things like biological control. And so on this trip itself, students get to join CCA's super fun river team on the Ruby Horse Thief section of the Colorado River, which goes through McInnes Canyon's National Conservation Area. Then on the second day of your trip, you wake up and you work with Bureau of Land Management staff and Palisade Insectary staff to actually learn how to do ecological monitoring. You go out and survey different plots of land, looking at the biodiversity of the plants that are growing in these areas to understand whether Russian knapweed is creating a monoculture, so when you have just one species completely taking over an area. They are better at using resources, or they'll take up space, they'll take resources away from some of the plants that are used to growing along the Colorado River and that we kind of need to have growing along the Colorado River. These are plants that might serve some kind of role in the ecosystem. They might serve as shelter or food or play some part in these relationships between species. So when you have something like Russian knapweed that can come in and just squeeze out all of those native plants, it can drastically impact an ecosystem.
Nikki Grant Hoffman, Ecologist and Science Coordinator out of the Grand Junction Field Office for the Bureau of Land Management, working with McInnes Canyons and Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Areas. The Bureau of Land Management is a federal agency. We manage public lands, so these are lands that are owned by the American public, by the American citizens, and it's here for the American people. Kind of our motto is multiple use, sustain, yield, so the idea that we use these lands, we use the resources from these lands, but we're trying to use them in a sustainable way, in a way that they'll be around for generations to come. When we get invasive species coming in, it can really start to degrade the ecological integrity of those areas, which can have effects on other things that we might want to use those lands for, like grazing or recreation. Ecological integrity, when you're talking about that, you're talking about a system that's functioning. So where the vegetation, the plants that are growing are healthy, they're reproducing, they're doing what they need to do. The wildlife that depends on that vegetation has sustained populations, they're kind of doing what they need to do. Your soils are in place, you're not seeing extra erosion, and your water systems are kind of working the way they're supposed to. When that starts to unravel, when you start to see degradation, you can have problem with, for example, excessive erosion, which, obviously if you have a lot of erosion, then that's gonna have effects on your vegetation, which is gonna have effects on your wildlife, and kind of your system can start to unravel. So when we're talking about plant species, a native species is going to be something that's here. It's been found here, it evolved here, that's going to be a native species. A non-native species is going to be something that was brought here by people. So it was introduced either on purpose or accidentally. So for example, tamarisk was introduced on purpose, Russian knapweed was introduced accidentally. Often this happens with things like contaminated hay or things that were brought in as ornamentals, so something that someone planted in their garden because it was really beautiful and then was able to kind of escape and get out into other areas. So you can have non-native species, and then there's a difference between non-native species and invasive species. So you can have non-native species that were brought here that don't necessarily belong here, but that don't really cause any problems, that don't really change the way the system is functioning. And then you have species that are changing the way the system is functioning. So things like tamarisk, cheatgrass, Russian knapweed actually are able to reproduce and take over and do something that changes the way that system would have functioned under the native plant scenario. And Russian knapweed is another invasive species. It's a forb, so it's a flowering plant. It's not, a woody species. Grows really well in our riparian area. Russian knapweed has a couple of things going on. One of the biggest things is that it's allelopathic, so that means that it's exuding chemicals out of its roots. The chemicals that it's exuding from its roots are basically poisoning the soil. It's making it really difficult for anything else to live. So the Russian gall wasp is a biological agent for Russian knapweed. So when we talk about a biological agent, we're talking about something that can help with an invasive species, and it's biological, so it's living. We're going to use something else living to try and control the invasive species that we're having a problem with. When you're looking at a biological agent, you want something that's really specific to that species. And so the Russian gall wasp is able to form galls on the Russian knapweed and stunt its growth, keep it from reproducing as well, which will help control it over the long term. Biological agents work a little bit differently than some of the other control methods they have. It's kind of a longer term vision. So versus, if you spray the plant, it's going to be dead right then. With biological control, you're really trying to get it to a better level. So make that invasive species behave more like just a regular non-native species. We not only released the biological control agent in the target area that we wanted to, but we also got some really great baseline monitoring data. You have to get good data about what happened, what was the outcome of your experiment or of your action. And that's kind of where monitoring comes into that. On this greening stem project along the Colorado River, the monitoring that the students are doing is going to be extremely useful. It will tell us a couple of things. So early on, it will tell us if our biological agent is even present in the area. It's been released there, but biological controls are living creatures, and so it doesn't always go the way you expect. And sometimes it can take a couple of releases for those biological controls to get established. So once they're established, we also need to see if they're being effective. Are enough galls being created to actually have an impact on the population of Russian knapweed? So that's kind of another thing that the monitoring data can tell us. Are we seeing natives starting to increase? If we're not, it may be that there's another management action needed. Monitoring can kind of tell us all of those different things and help kind of guide, where our management's going to go and what are the next steps in terms of helping put this system back together to a functioning state.
The students on this trip are going to monitor the Russian knapweed to observe and count and study the impact of this biocontrol agent. So they're going to go in, they're going to measure stems, they're going to count flowers, and they're also going to look at the plants to observe if there's any stem galls. My name is Sonia Daly. I'm a biocontrol specialist with the Palisade Insectary, Colorado Department of Agriculture. There's different methods that you can utilize to control a non-native weed, and what we offer here at the facility is utilizing biocontrol, using a natural way, a lower cost, reducing pesticide usage to help control Russian knapweed. Biocontrol is a natural method to help control a non-native pest. Russian knapweed is a non-native invasive weed in Colorado in the western U.S. It is a perennial forb, which means it is a non-woody plant that flowers every year. Russian knapweed's flowers are pink and purple, and it is an invader in roadsides, agriculture lands, rangelands and riparian zones, and it's poisonous and fatal to horses. Russian knapweed was accidentally introduced in the early 1900s. It is native to Eurasia, so regions in Europe and Asia, so you can find it in some parts of China, Mongolia, Turkey, and southern Russia. So when immigrants came over in the early 1900s, the immigrant farmers had their native seeds like alfalfa, and Russian knapweed seeds were mixed in with them. And so when the immigrants farmers planted in America, it was accidentally introduced with the crops. Russian knapweed is non-native to America and has less plants that can compete against Russian knapweed. When it got introduced over to America, it disrupted balance where it was out-competing the natives. In this case, the Russian stem gall wasps are natural enemies to Russian knapweed. A gall wasp is a tiny flying insect that induces galls on plants. It is a stingless insect, so it's not like your flying yellow jacket wasps that you see flying around summer. They won't sting you, and they lay eggs on the foliage and develops the abnormal growth on the plant that we call a gall that houses the immature form of the insect. A gall is developed by the female wasp laying its eggs on the tissue, and when the eggs hatch, the larvae's feeding starts to trigger that gall formation. And when that egg is hatched in there, the plant is defending against the hatchlings and in essence developing a house for the larvae. It's a really cool interaction. So it's a natural enemy to that Russian knapweed, and the stem galls help decrease flowering, and it actually can inhibit stem growth. As we get less flowering, we'll get less seeds, and it's impacting the stem growth and overall going to impact that root system. Over time, it can suppress the weed and help control the spread. The stems are a lot shorter and stunted. As you know, they're feeding within that nutrient source, they're tapping into the xylem and phloem, they're tapping into the water and sugar source of that plant. So it's disrupting the nutrient flow of that stem to inhibit the growth. So these tiny little wasps in early spring emerge from the previous year's stems, and they get this cue from temperature to come out of the stems, and there is new growing Russian knapweed around them, and the females will lay mature eggs within the stem, and when the eggs hatch within the stem, the larvae start to feed, developing that bulge, that abnormal growth, and they kind of look like pea pods at times, and so the larvae will continue feeding throughout summer. We have 3 different instar growths of the larvae. So the 3 different instars are first, second, and third, of course. And at third instar, the last growth, they will choose to overwinter and dormant in the stem during winter. So they will spend their lifetime within the stem. And when they get that cue again in spring, as we get warming temperatures, they will start to pupate and transform into adults. And the adults will then emerge from the stem and the life cycle starts again. The stem gall wasp can stay in a stem gall naturally for 2 years. We want to see if the biocontrol agent is recovering or establishing at site. And therefore monitoring is very important to observe if the agent is present or absent. And that's very good data to have.